Hello, team. This week we're going to discuss some concepts regarding weeds and turf. We're going to break down the different considerations for each area of the golf course, some general strategies for control, and how we go about managing various types of weeds in our turf grass. First, let's recall what is a weed. Remember, any plant out of place is a weed. So when we talk about our greens, tees, and fairways, we primarily want to have creeping bentgrass. The primary rough is a mixture of Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, and turf-type tall fescue. And the fescue rough is a combination of the fine fescue species. So outside of these desired turfgrass species, everything else is going to be considered a weed and therefore it must be managed or eradicated from the stand. From a cultural standpoint, weed management is very similar to disease management. If we are able to execute an agronomic strategy that supports a growing environment that favors our desired turf species, our desired turf species will therefore be able to outcompete weed species and prevent infestation. A healthy and dense stand of actively growing turf is the primary method of weed control. Along the same lines, low mowing is often referred to as the best method for weed control. The reason being, there are a limited number of plant species that tolerate the heights of cut found on a golf course. This leads to situations where the most problematic weed species for golf courses are those that tolerate putting green height of cut. So low mowing will not eradicate and prevent these weeds from proliferating in your stand. The most famous weed that tolerates putting green height of cut is Poa annua or annual bluegrass. Poa annua is considered a weed because it is a prolific seed head producer. When Poa annua is in bloom, the seed heads create a bumpy putting surface that will negatively impact playability. Chemical solutions in the form of herbicides for Poa annua on a putting green are tricky to say the least. For one, a putting green with a high concentration of annual bluegrass will be unplayable if a herbicide knocks out all of the Poa annua. This can sometimes result in having to regrass the greens, and the greatest cost associated with regrassing greens is the requirement that the course be closed for several months, and this will significantly reduce revenue. So many facilities that grow cool season turf choose to manage the Poa annua that invades the putting greens. The goal in managing Poa annua is to prevent the seed head expression. The plant growth regulator proxy with the active ingredient ethifon essentially tricks Poa annua into stopping seed production. The plant growth regulator strategy requires planning. The greatest efficacy from proxy is associated with a late fall application and subsequent applications the following spring. The spring applications are timed using a combination of growing degree day models and phenological indicators. These timing methods, the growing degree day models, and phenological indicators will be covered in our upcoming series of quick hits as part of Laurel Creek's new apprenticeship program. Now, in other turf areas, such as the tees, fairways, and roughs, where some turf loss is tolerable, Poa annua may be eradicated. There is mechanical removal in the form of plugging, and this method also can be used on putting greens, but at a certain point, the concentration of Poa annua makes plugging unrealistic. There are some chemical options, including PoaCure and Poa Constrictor. However, selective herbicide applications are not risk-free treatments. Damage to non-target and desired species is possible if label instructions are not followed or the application is administered during periods of turf stress. Another solution is a biological control for annual bluegrass, and this is used by delaying larvicide applications that target the early larval stages of the annual bluegrass weevil. In the pictures here, you see the last pass in the approach from a green spray. On the greens, where there's a high concentration of Poa annua and also playability is paramount, all life stages of the ABW are treated on and around the putting surface. Just outside of this green spray, however, is damage to Poa annua that is experiencing ABW larva feeding. So the larval feeding puts the Poa annua under stress and allows the creeping bentgrass to crowd out the Poa annua. Eventually, a larvicide for the late stage annual bluegrass weevil larva will be applied before the larger larvae start feeding on the bentgrass. So a couple methods of eradication in the other turf areas on the golf course. So putting Poa annua aside, if selective herbicides are risky, how do we prevent weeds on all 240 something acres of turf on the golf course? Well, we employ a pre-emergent herbicide strategy. A great way to fix a problem is to never have the problem in the first place, right? Plus, large and mature weeds can take a long time to succumb to even the strongest post-emergent herbicides. The general strategy with pre-emergence involves the application of a broad spectrum product, and a broad spectrum product is one that prevents the emergence of a large variety of weed species. Research has shown that a fall application followed up with a spring application improves the efficacy of the pre-emergence. The multiple application approach allows for a lower rate of active ingredient to be applied during each treatment. Rather than a single high rate application, the multiple lower rate applications prolong the control provided by the active ingredients. A potential measure of the success of your pre-emergent program would be the need for only spot treatments with selective herbicides during the growing season. Much more targeted applications that mitigate the risk associated with selective post-emergent herbicides. And to wrap up here, an example of a pre-emergent strategy could be a fall application of the pre-emergent herbicide prodiamine, followed up in the spring with an application of the pre-emergent herbicide dithopyr. So those are two fairly common pre-emergent herbicides that are utilized frequently in golf turf management. Now we focus in on the heavy-hitting post-emergent products. These products are used almost exclusively in the fescue rough areas. A couple examples are Fusilade and Segment that are only labeled for use on fine fescue species. This image shows what happens when Fusilade is applied to primary rough, and it will do the same and maybe worse to any stand of bentgrass. So care when applying these herbicides is extremely important. Pilex and Target are also very effective post-emergent herbicides used in the fescue rough. Bentgrass species are very susceptible to both Pilex and Target. So the reason we need aggressive products in the fescue is informed by the mowing strategy of the fescue. Fescue rough is mowed one, maybe two times a year. Therefore, weeds that emerge in the fescue have the opportunity to reach maturity. Over time, these weed species can take over the fine fescue and severely decrease playability out of these penal areas, if a player is even able to find their ball, that is. So even though the fescue rough is meant to be penal, it must still be playable, and for the sake of pace of play, players should be able to find their ball in a reasonable amount of time. Another reason weeds must be treated in the fescue rough is seed-producing weeds can begin to encroach on the primary rough and other fine turf areas. We saw what these aggressive post-emergence do to species other than fine fescues. So when these weeds invade other areas on the golf course, our chemical options become very limited. You see here the movement of dwarf fountain grass into the primary rough surrounds of a tee box, and the methods of eradicating this dwarf fountain grass are almost exclusively limited to mechanical removal. Finally, we arrive at areas that are left unmanaged. These areas may be referred to as native areas or naturalized areas. At Laurel Creek, buffer zones have been established around all ponds and wetlands. These areas are left untreated to prevent runoff of chemicals into surface waters on our property. Additionally, areas that are significantly removed from play are left untreated during post-emergence applications. Some weed species, such as milkweed, are valuable food sources for pollinators. Excluding these areas from herbicide applications thus establishes wildlife gardens where pollinators are able to proliferate. That concludes our week 11 video on weeds and turf. Let's have a great week.